The Finnish Novgorodian Wars were a series of conflicts between Finnic tribes in eastern Fennoscandia and the Republic of Novgorod from the 11th or 12th century to early 13th century. The war's effect on the Finns' society contributed to the eventual Swedish conquest of Finland in around 1249. The term used in Russian chronicles, to refer to Novgorod's enemy, Häme, is highly obscure and probably referred to several different groups. Some of the groups identified as Häme may have been the inhabitants of Tavastland, also called Häme in Finnish, in south-central Finland, the West Finns in general, or a subgroup of Karelians on the northern coast of the Ladoga. Early developments. The only known written sources on the Häme Novgorodian Wars are contained in the medieval Russian chronicles. The Russians and Häme had frequent conflicts from the 11th or 12th century onwards. The eastern Finnic peoples Vodst, Karelia and Igorians are all mentioned as allies to Novgorod, said to have been fighting against Häme even without Novgorod's direct involvement, possibly over control of land area in central and eastern Finland. This territorial feud manifested in annual retaliatory expeditions that featured merciless treatment of the settlers of the opposing tribe. The earliest possible mention of hostilities is from the Laurentian Codex, which records in passing that the Novgorodian prince Vladimir Yaroslavich was at war with the Häme in 1042 AD. The Häme are also mentioned as tributaries to Novgorod in the primary chronicle, but they disappear from sources later on. It is disputed whether Häme was an earlier form of Häme, or an altogether different people, perhaps living east of Lake Onega. Conflicts certainly began in the early 12th century, however information on them remains very scarce. According to the Novgorod First Chronicle, another prince of Novgorod, Vsevolod Mstislavich, and his troops from Novgorod were at war with Häme during a great famine in 1123. The chronicle leaves any further developments of the conflict open, including the whereabouts of the fight. Häme pillaged Novgorodian area in 1142, but were defeated near Ladoga with 400 casualties. Coincidentally or not, Swedes attacked Novgorodians in the same year as well. Karelia, now under Novgorodian influence, were at war with Häme in the following year, but were forced to flee, losing 2 ships. Häme attacked Russian soil again in 1149 with 1,000 men. Novgorodians, totaling 500, went in pursuit of the Häme, utterly defeating them, with Vodst, a Finnic tribe in alliance with Novgorod. Vodst, today almost extinct, lived south of the present-day St. Petersburg, probably making this the deepest attack that Häme ever made into Russian territory. After a long pause in open hostilities, at least in the chronicles, a Novgorodian called Vyshyata Vasilievich led his troops against Häme in 1186, returning unharmed with prisoners. It is not clear whether he took his forces to fight in the land of Häme or to defend his country against an intrusion. Reasons for the renewed fighting have not been identified. Karelia accompanied Novgorodians for yet another attack against Häme in 1191. This time the fighting is clearly said to have taken place the land of the Häme, the first such entry in Russian chronicles. The assailants burned the country and killed the cattle. Very hypothetically, this may have been the same attack that was mentioned in a much later Swedish chronicle, Chronicon Episcoporum Finlandensium by Bishop Paulus Juason from the mid-16th century, that knows Russians to have burned Turkus in 1198, at the time of Bishop Fulcanus. Russian chronicles have no information about a conflict that year. It should be noted that the town of Turku did not exist before the end of the 13th century. After this, there is no information on further Novgorodian conflicts for several decades. It is also impossible to confirm whether the 1191 war resulted in a brief Novgorodian rule in parts of Finland or Karelia. However, a later chronicle entry from the mid-1220s said that Russian princes had not been able to dwell in the land of Häme, Swedish and papal involvement. At the same time, Sweden and Novgorod were in conflict as well. Pope Alexander III, in his letter to the Archbishop of Uppsala and Jarl Guttorm of Sweden in 1171, perhaps refers to the Finns' struggle against Novgorod by demanding Sweden take over Finnish fortresses in exchange for protection. In the late 15th century, historian Erika Solai claimed that Bishop Cole of Linköping had been the Jarl of Finland, possibly leading Swedish troops temporarily situated in Finland. He may have been in a military role similar to that of John Jarl, who allegedly spent 9 years overseas fighting against Novgorodians and Ingrams at the end of the 12th century. Also noteworthy is the so-called First Swedish Crusade, which, according to several 15th-century sources, took place in 1150. The crusade is only known from later legends that presented the expedition as a Christian mission, headed by a saint king to baptize heathens. However, it seems to have followed the exceptionally edgy 1140s with both the Häme and Swedes fighting against Novgorod. Some historians have seen it as a direct reaction to the failed Häme expedition in 1149, associating it with the cooperation mentioned by the Pope 20 years later. In 1221, Pope Honorius III was again worried about the situation after receiving alarming information from the Archbishop of Uppsala. He authorized the unnamed Bishop of Finland to establish a trade embargo against the barbarians that threatened the Christianity in Finland. The nationality of the barbarians, presumably a citation from Archbishop's earlier letter, remains unknown, and was not necessarily known even by the Pope. However, as the trade embargo was widened 8 years later, it was specifically said to be against the Russians. Russian sources mention Swedish-Häme cooperation in 1240 at the earliest. It was then that were mentioned as one of the Swedes' allies in the little-documented Battle of the Neva. The first reliable mention of Häme being a part of Swedish forces is from 1256, 7 years after the conventional dating of the so-called Second Swedish Crusade. Final War. The final known conflict between Häme and Novgorod took place in the 1220s, following decades of peace, at least in the chronicles. After having secured his power in Novgorod by 1222, Grand Prince Yaroslav II of Vladimir organized a series of attacks against Estonia, Häme and Karelia. The offensive against Häme took place in winter 1226–27. The same winter Yaroslav, son of Vsevolod, left Novgorod over the sea against Häme where no else Russian prince had been able to dwell, and he conquered the land and returned to Novgorod praising God with many prisoners. When those who were accompanying him could not handle all the prisoners, they killed some of them but released many more. The Häme retaliatory expedition in summer 1228 against Ladoga, allegedly with more than 2,000 men, ended in disaster. As described by the Novgorod First Chronicle, the Häme came to Lake Ladoga to war, and word about that came to Novgorod on the Ascension Day of the Christ, and Novgorodians took the barges and rowed to Ladoga with Prince Yaroslav. Vladislav, the bailiff at Ladoga, and the people of Ladoga did not wait for the Novgorodians, but went after them in boats where they were fighting, met with them and fought them, and then came night, and they landed on an island. But Finns were on the coast with prisoners, for they had been fighting close to the lake near the landing place, and in Olonets. The same night they asked for peace, but the bailiff and the people of Ladoga did not grant it, and they killed all the prisoners and ran into forests after abandoning the ships. Many of them fell there, but the boats were burned, and of those who had come, 2,000 or more were were killed, God knows, and the rest were all killed. The war seems to have been the end of independent Novgorodian conflicts. Based on papal letters from 1229, the unknown Bishop of Finland took advantage of the chaotic situation by taking over non-Christian places of worship and moving the see to a more suitable location. On the bishop's request, the Pope also enforced a trade embargo against Novgorodians on the Baltic Sea, at least in Visby, Riga and Lubeck. A few years later, the Pope also requested the Livonian Brothers of the Sword send troops to protect Finland. Whether any knights ever arrived remains unknown. Novgorodian wars were a factor contributing to the eventual Swedish conquest of Finland around 1249. Under Swedish rule, the wars continued to rage in Finland as a part of Swedish Novgorodian wars.